The part that needs more hype is just it does so much right now. I think that part of the challenge in the market is there's so many people talking about the future and what it might do that people have kind of lost track of like how powerful it is just in its current form. Hi, I'm Noah Brier. I guess I'm a reformed SaaS founder, spending about 15 years building software companies. And more recently, the founder of a company called Brand AI, BRXND.ai, which is an organization at the intersection of marketing and AI. We put on events for marketers all around the world. And then most recently, although I haven't really told anyone yet, a new company called Alephic, whose aim is to help CMOs answer their hardest questions using AI code and expertise from inside their organizations.
Noah, thank you so much for joining. You and I obviously know each other for a long time. Maybe just explain kind of what you do, because you are a man of many talents.
Yeah, well, I guess I am a little bit of a bunch of different things. I started my career as a writer. I was a journalist for a little while, and then I moved into advertising. I was a creative director, copywriter, did a bunch of stuff there, and started my first software company in 2011. It was a company called Percolate. We sold that in 2019. We went through the whole process, raised lots of money, did the whole thing. And then about 2 years ago, I was like, I just need a break from everything, and just went back to writing code. I wanted no employees and no investors. I just didn't want to talk to anybody. I just wanted to sit in a room and build things. And it was a good time to start building things because AI was sort of really just, it's like GPT-3 APIs were available. Halfway through the year, some of the image models started to come online. Henrik and I worked on one of the very first AI things that I worked on together. And then I just been essentially exploring over the last 2 years. Actually, lately I've been explaining my journey as, the explore exploit trade-off.
Yes.
So I've been kind of thinking of it as like, I went into explore mode for 2 years. And then actually over the last sort of 6 weeks, I finally decided what I wanted to do. And so I'm sort of starting to make the transition out of pure explore mode because I was doing a bunch of fun stuff, building things with big brands. And I was like, I think this is kind of what I want to be doing. And
Okay. Hang on. There's so many things that already you just have to stop because, first of all, I don't know if Henrik told you that this would be catnip for me, but explore exploits. What do you think's going to happen here, Henrik? How do you know when to shift? Let's just start there. By the way, we'll talk about AI at some point, I'm sure. But as you have been an explorer, and it sounds like you're moving into exploit. What were you keying in on as an innovator or as an explorer that said, "Okay, now it's time"?
I think really for me, what's happened, so my journey over the last 2 years is like, I was building things, I was experimenting with things. Henrik and I built a funny dog generator where we crossed all the dog breeds together. And I started a conference about marketing and AI. I did all this stuff. And then a bunch of brands came to me and I was building things with the brands. And really what happened is sort of like around 6 months ago, I started to get calls from CMOs who were like, hey, we have this problem that we need to solve. And actually, like, it doesn't really have anything directly to do with AI, but like maybe now that AI exists, we could solve it. And I was like, oh, well, that's pretty fun. And I started doing a bunch of those. And I was like, yeah, this is awesome. I kind of just want to be doing this. I just want to work on really weird, hard problems that 2 years ago you could have solved maybe with like, 6 months or a year or 2 years and lots of people and lots of budget. And now we can do it in 2 weeks or 4 weeks.
Don't say it. I was going to say, don't say weeks. Okay. So what's like the canonical example of a thing that a CMO asked for?
Can I, before we jump into that, I'm just going to tease out the AI a little bit.
Okay.
Because honestly, Noah, you and I, we've spoken this before, but like I am obsessed with this in between time, which is basically this wonderful, vulnerable, exciting, curious, daunting time that entrepreneurs have when they are in between what they have just left and their new thing. And if you're a lawyer, then your next job is as a lawyer. So life is kind of easy in that way. When you're an entrepreneur, we tend never to want to do the thing that we just did. And so it's kind of weird. And everybody, because we're so linked to the narrative of our last startup, we kind of have to go out in many ways, redefine our self-narrative. And so as you're coming out on the other side of the in-between time, for people who have either started or going into that phase, any kind of like takeaways on how to make that less stressful and more enjoyable?
Well, I think for me, a lot of it was like starting from a place of returning to the stuff I like doing the most, right? So it's like, after many years of running a relatively large company and spending a lot of time managing people and dealing with HR issues, one of the things I was desperate to do was just get back to work, like building things and sort of feeling the creative energy that you get when you make something. And so I think my main priority was to open up more time for that and let everything kind of flow from there. I'm a hands-on learner. I think one thing entrepreneurs have in common is that they're not very good at learning things they don't experience. You've got to have that thing. And for me, as somebody who also likes building and writing code, that's particularly true with technology. And so I think that was the biggest piece, is just kind of like finding that baseline. The thing I missed most in that time of running Percolate was just, eventually you've built a company and you're hiring the people that hire the people that build the things. And I was just desperate to get back to being the one who got to build the things. And so everything really flowed from there for me. And then it was very much just being in the explore mindset. I didn't think about it in explore exploit terms until very recently. Now that I look back, it was like, I just sort of said yes to everything. And I kind of did lots of random stuff. I put on a conference for no reason other than I was being interviewed for an article. And I said I was going to have a conference. Like I didn't have a plan before that. And I actually, the guy who was interviewing me, I don't think he really believed me. And he was like, "Are you sure you want me to include that in the article?" And I was like, "Yeah, totally."
Yeah, because then that will hold my feet to the fire.
Exactly.
And we do it.
So it was very much like sort of yes mode, but also, I don't know, this is the most magical moment I've ever experienced in my life, right? I mean, I remember when I got my first computer, but like I very vividly remember a few years ago, the first thing that blew my mind was taking a unstructured page and sending it to the GPT-3 API and with some JSON and getting a structured output back. And I was just like, wow, I'm like never going to do this any other way ever again in my entire life. And it sort of all just followed from there on the AI side. Like a lot of the work I've been doing and even putting on the conference was like with the explicit intent of, I think AI kind of like needs, in some ways it needs less hype and in some ways it needs more hype. Like it needs less hype in that we don't need to promise these giant things. And I think like whatever AGI may or may not come true in whatever time frame, and people can speculate on that. But like the part that needs more hype is just, it does so much right now. I think that part of the challenge in the market is there's so many people talking about the future and what it might do that people have kind of lost track of like how powerful it is just in its current form. And that's sort of like, I feel like I've spent the last 2 years trying to convince people that like, you don't really need to look into the future on this one. You can just go.
So one thing you're reminding me of that Ethan Mollick said to us when he was on the show was, even if all development stopped, it's going to take the world 10 years to catch up with the current capabilities. So again, not thinking about the future, the overhyped part, but thinking about the present and the underhyped part. What are you seeing that you would say is currently underhyped? What are the specific capabilities or modes of interaction, use cases, et cetera, that you go, people really knew, even just to do this, their lives would be different?
Well, I have a great one. I was at a dinner recently and I got seated next to the CIO of one of the biggest media companies in the world. And he was sort of like, a little bit maybe of an AI skeptic. And he said to me, like, how do you articulate the value of this stuff? And I was like, I don't know, like how much of your job as CIO is about making data from one place be able to work in with data from the other place? And he was like, kind of all of it. And I was like, that's the thing AI does best, right? AI does the transformation of data from one format to another. That was my JSON experience, right? Like I took unstructured data in the form of a web page and turned it into structured JSON. But the same is true everywhere. And if you think about like how much work happens inside organizations that is fundamentally like asking a person to turn unstructured data structured, Salesforce and CRM is about taking salespeople and asking them to turn their unstructured sales meetings into structured data, right? Like now we record the meetings and literally I just built a thing for my new company where we take the meeting transcripts and, out comes a full readout of the meeting in the exact format we want with the sort of opportunities identified and everything else. Like,
I'll give you another example, which I think would be so much in your world, and you've probably already done it, but like we've started a Bark to have build bots that allow the salespeople to get interviewed by a bot so they can write a design brief in the way that designers really like it. And it just seemed to be like such an obvious thing, but like obviously they have all the information, they just don't know how to articulate it in a way that the designers kind of enjoy.
Totally. And, I mean, to me, sort of the core feature of AI is that it can be this fuzzy interface that sits between anything and anything else. And a lot of problems can be boiled down to needing a fuzzy interface that can sit between anything and anything else. Like it just becomes a creative exercise of how you're going to get there. And sometimes you need more than one step. And, we can go into kind of how you build and what you build and why you build. But to me, it's that fundamental thing. Like if you stripped away everything else you can do, I think there's so much focus on it, like writing things and whatever, like the thing I use most in whether I'm working myself or working for other folks, the kind of core function is taking data that currently exists in one format, whether it's unstructured or structured, and changing it into a different format so that you can use it in this totally new way that somebody didn't imagine.
It reminds me about one of the things that one of our partners and I have worked on is a bot. Henrik, you say bot or made me think of this, but a pro sports organization realized that their HR department, because of many initiatives, which we don't have to name, the HR department's processes are increasingly onerous on hiring managers and the rest of the organization. And they have very kind of specific formats that they need stuff kind of output in or input into, depending on how you think about it. And we basically help them identify an opportunity to build a bot which takes a hiring manager from an unstructured conversation into the specified kind of, characterize it the way you want, the output that HR requires. And no surprise, hiring managers like that a lot more than sitting with the Word document or the PDF that they've got to edit, right? But it's actually not hard. But the other thing I would say is it reminds me, Henrik, of the conversation that we had with Greg McEwen and Dave McRaney, which never may be published, I don't know, but is this idea of English to English translation. I mean, Noah, what you're talking about is one format to another. At the most kind of conceptual level, there's also the Jeremy English to Noah English. And for example, if Noah English is not the way you understand that, if what you replace the word dialect, right? Or replace the word personality, right? But there's also an opportunity for the fuzzy interface to actually enable human beings to understand each other in a way that they previously don't.
Can I ask you guys a question on that one, actually? Because the HR one is very sort of top of mind for me, not specifically, but generally. Like one of the things I really wonder is like, is it the best thing in those situations to build the thing that you're describing, or to just recognize that it's really dumb that we have all these things in place that involve all this bureaucracy and this sort of heavy duty requirements set, and try to fix those? I don't know. That's one of the ones I've been running into in my own work quite a bit lately.
Intellectually, I think that if you think of everything as inputs and outputs, I think sometimes we have to make the input output in the process because that is what everybody will feel comfortable with, knowing that at one point we can skip that step. But I think right now, like we're basically all LLMs in one way, right? Like I'll give you a prompt as a question and you give me a response as a vocal answer. And I, in a kind of a weird way, the way I'm computing the future of a lot of work is that we will be prompting humans and LLMs, and then we would get responses and we would choose basically the LM or the human, depending on what the skill sets are of those specific. The thing that, question for you on the meeting stuff, we had a guy on the podcast recently and he did a pretty cool thing that after we did the interview, he basically then showed how he would normally do, basically how he would feed the interview into an LM, and then he was extracting things like what are the key insights, what are some of the quotes I should keep and stuff like that. As you just was talking about, you just did it. Are there anything specific that you're trying to extract out of meetings that could be useful?
No, I mean, well, I think that the broader point here, which is again, in sort of my own experience and my own decision to kind of move in a little away from the sort of pure explorer, is like, I have found that the real trick with all this stuff is that you combine the AI, you combine code, and then you combine the sort of unique expertise of the individual who has sort of a specific way that they want to work. And so we have our own ways. My new company I started with a guy you might know named James Gross. Um, and James
Band
is
is
my
coming back
co-founder.
together.
Yeah.
Jeremy, this is like the equivalent of the Blues Brothers, where it seems like Nora's like about to now drive a truck around and
Yeah.
getting people back in the band.
So, James from our Percolate days had a very specific format. Every salesperson in the organization used to publish a thing called the field report after every sales call. And in that field report, it had a kind of fairly specific format. Everybody hated it, right? Because for the exact reasons we described earlier, like they don't like having to go in and write stuff up after had the meeting. But it was really helpful, and it was a great way to kind of distribute knowledge and information throughout the organization. And so, I think what we have done is taken a lot of his thinking about what matters and what you're listening for when you're having a call with somebody that is specific to him. So, like what are the opportunities, and specifically what does an opportunity mean, and all of these types of things. But I think, again, in my own journey, I think I started from a place of like, well, maybe there's a SaaS company to start, right? Because I've spent a lot of time starting SaaS companies. And I think one of the conclusions I came to is I don't know what the SaaS company is, because I think so much of the value is in the specificity, right? So, our specific workflow and output that we're looking for is probably fairly generalizable to companies that look like ours. But, the beauty is to change the specifics to exactly the thing you want.
Right.
I mean, that's not even weeks or days or even hours, right? That's like 3 minutes in one of the prompts to change a couple pieces. Like, it's not even,
There's a
lot.
problem. To your point, it's actually, that's where the majority of the work happens, is that last little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of work in sort of breaking down the problems. I think one of the other things I've come to recognize is that I think there's a little bit of confusion in the market about the difference between AI models and AI software. And we even see with the new OpenAI 1 model, right? It's sort of doing this chain of thought process that we have been doing. Anybody building things has been using sort of chain of thought in various forms for a while now. It was a paper published by Google in 2022. And I think a lot of what I've built over the last few years has been not just chain of thought on an individual prompt level, but chain of thought blown out to workflow, right? So it's like you have chain of thought chained together multiple times, and that's how you get sort of valuable output. And the reality is that like most hard problems require that kind of workflow, right? Like I was talking to a journalist recently and trying to explain this, and I just said, like, sit down for 15 minutes with a pen and paper or whatever, your computer, and just write the article, versus run your regular process where you like do research, you interview people, you like figure it out, you talk to your editor, you go back. Like, what's going to have a better output? Obviously, the large language models themselves are great at that single step, but when you tie them together and you use many steps, that's where the sort of real value is. And you can build that expertise, not just into the individual prompt, but into the way you sort of architect the whole system, right? And so I've come to find, somewhat surprisingly, that like my experience in building software systems turns out to be like really useful in this AI thing, because one part of it is how do you prompt the system? And some of that just comes from like experience. But another part of it is like, how do you model the data? How do you model the workflow? How do you think about breaking things up? And that's like kind of software development 101, right? Like talk to any engineer.
No, I can go back to basically the experience. One of the things that I often get asked is obviously same questions as you were being asked by the CIO, is like, what can I use it for now? And I think that's a really like important kind of like point. And I obviously use it for everything, and so have gotten incredibly more efficient. One of the things that's been complicated as I've been thinking about it is when you try to atomize what I'm doing, is that I have a little bit of like experience in a specific domain. I know a little bit about AI, so I understand which foundational models I should use and what kind of APIs that are out there. I know a little bit about technology, so when I need to kind of tie these things together, I can, look at JSON or Python, and then I enjoy talking to people, so I understand how to wrap all this kind of like into a chat or communication kind of methodology that kind of is relevant to this week's perfing. None of these things are very complicated, like if you just take one. But if I was thinking like, who do I send to somebody? If somebody's asking something like, who should I hire to help me come up with like 10 bots so that I can be 40% more efficient. You kind of go, oh, you can't really be an engineer or a classic one. It's not a business person, right? It's not the AI expert. So what is the steps that you suggest to people to help them through this journey?
I'm not sure yet. I don't know. It's like, I do have a bunch of those things, right? And like I write code. I've built companies. I sort of generally think in products, right? And I do think that you're probably massively underselling your ability to think in products. Cause I think that again, like I think even bot sort of undersells it. Like what we're building is kind of like applications in which we're outsourcing sort of intelligence and decision-making in various steps, right? And so your ability to sort of break down problems in the way that you naturally do when you build products turns out to be like very helpful for this, right? Because you're like, hey, I need to figure out, well, but to do that well, I have to break it into 3 problems, not just one problem. And then actually like, this is the best way to solve this one. This is the best way to solve that one. I think if we step all the way back, I had this sort of moment a year and a half ago now almost, where I got access to build a ChatGPT plugin for the first time. And my job over the last 2 years has been do whatever I want. And so like I canceled all my meetings that morning after I got the email that said I had gotten access to ChatGPT plugin API. I was just like, this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to sit and like try to build the plugin and see what it's like. And so, I've done a lot of software integration, and then I went to read the API docs, and I expected to see API docs that looked fairly familiar. And when I opened the ChatGPT plugin API docs, basically it said you put a manifest file in the root directory of your application. And in that file, you describe how you want data sent to you, and you describe how data is going to be sent back to us, and we'll deal with the rest. And like, that is fundamentally the opposite of how everything else I have ever built is built, because in every other case, whether it's Google or Meta or whoever, whatever API, Salesforce you're interacting with, they write the API spec, they tell you how to send data, they tell you how data is going to get sent back. As long as you do both in exactly the way they describe, everything is going to work fine. And so, I had this moment where I was like, oh, this is actually counterintuitive, right? I have a lifetime of intuition for how to use computers and how to build things. And this runs counter to that intuition in the like truest sense. And so I think to answer your question of like, where do you start and why is it? Honestly, I think people just have to get their hands on it. And I think part of the challenge with answering the question, Henrik, about what is this good for? What do you use it for? Is some of it is just that so much of it is so trivial, but when you put it all together, it's amazing, right? So, I can talk about this kind of big application I just built for, pulling down the transcripts and doing all this stuff. But like the reality is on my day-to-day basis, my keyboard shortcut for the ChatGPT Mac app spends a lot of time like taking stuff in. It's like, hey, can you fix the bullet formatting on this? Just like the stupid stuff that took you 90 seconds. Or when I'm writing code, it's like, okay, I could do that. That would take me 3 minutes. Like I might as well just have the system do it. Like yesterday, I've been using Cursor now, which is the new, whatever, it's not so new, but they've added support, the IDE that's added support for Sonnet 3.5. And, the big thing I was doing was when you're building an application, there's a bunch of pages that are basically the same. They just have slightly different data pulling into them. And you try to sort of abstract as much of that as you can into kind of components or whatever. But fundamentally, you still have to build a bunch of pages that have very little difference. And so I was just going in, and eventually I was like, wait, I could just prompt this thing and be like, hey, can you look at this page and just make a page for companies that works just like those two? I just want the list. And it's like, that is not hard work. It's 3 minutes of my time but now it
compounds.
It's 10 seconds, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, oh yeah, that's right. Like that's,
Okay. One thing I want to do, Noah, is come back to your comment about just people got to put their hands on it. And that's actually a recurring theme on this show. You talk to Jenny Nicholson, who I know you know, right? She talks about leaving her ad agency and having that Little House on the Prairie moment. I don't know if you've listened to our conversation with Russ Summers. It wasn't until he was laid off from his previous job that he had the space. So here's my question. Very few people are afforded either entrepreneurial, free range or a layoff. Do you think about, for friends of yours, maybe who aren't entrepreneurs, who aren't, largely autonomous, self-directed agents, but who are in the context of an organizational structure, for example, how do folks practically create, whether it's mechanisms, accountability, et cetera, to actually get hands on the device, so to speak?
Well, I think in organizations, it's a pretty funny moment right now where they're pretty hungry for people who are just going to go. I mean, like, yes, you have to be a little bit self-directed and you have to be a self-starter who's going to go do that. But I think, when I look around at the kind of companies that we work with, increasingly what I'm finding is we're working with folks who are not like the person with that job. They're the person who sort of just found a way to get going with it and just figured out ways to integrate it into their work. And normally it started outside of their work. And it's funny because I look back, like when we started Percolate, it was sort of in the social media explosion, and kind of much the same thing happened inside enterprises, right? Like at first it was CMOs saying, hey, I hear about this social media thing. We got to do something. They tried to make it happen top down. And then eventually they realized like, oh, actually there's like probably the best person to deal with this, and it's the person who knows the most about it. And it sort of became a bottoms up thing. And the funny thing is now, like 10 years later, many of those people are CMOs, right? They've moved to that point. So I'm not sure if it's a cop out, but it's like, the answer is you just have to like, just do it. But again, the challenge, and I totally get it, and I have a lot of empathy for folks, is like, you ask somebody, what should I do with it? I feel like the thing everybody goes and does is they ask it for something stupid and it gives them something stupid.
Or they Google their own name. They effectively Google themselves.
And it's like, at the first conference I did, I found this German word, which I'm not positive is a real word, but I've been running with it. It's a Fingerspitzengefühl, which is like fingertip feeling.
That is a real.
You just made that up. You just made that up. That's not a real word.
It's a real word because the Danes have adopted it.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, you need fingertip feeling, right? That's how you sort of learn. You know what it feels like. And this is one of those things where it's like, I think it's just so hard. So you just have to go try it and find ways to integrate it.
I actually love that. I totally love it. And I know Henrik's going to move our conversation along, so I just want to give you the gift. I don't know if you can see this Post-it, but this is a gift to you, okay, Noah, because you asked the question about the HR practice. Like, what do you do? I don't know if you remember, but like the fuzzy interface between what's required and whatever. And I realized as I was listening to you that you actually answered your own question in describing the field report. And here's the phrase I thought was really powerful: hated, but helpful, right? And there are processes that people hate, and they hate probably because they aren't naturally inclined to do it, but it doesn't make it wrong, right? And your co-founder, it sounds like, identified a hugely helpful practice that, sure, other people may not naturally do, therefore they hate it, but it's so helpful, it's worth overcoming that activation energy. To me, that the answer to your question lies in the balance of those two things.
The other one that I've heard recently is, what is it that you do at work that you don't get paid to do? And that most people have like something that they just end up always being the one who that does it. And that also seemed to be kind of like an interesting place to go and hunt for some of these things.
Yeah. And you just keep finding new ones, right? One of my favorites lately has been when I'm like working on some new problem or research. I do a lot of research. I'm like researching some new area. I realized I could load up a GPT with 20 papers and I've got a specific prompt. And then I kind of think with that GPT around that. So it's like I was doing a bunch of exploit reading. And so I like loaded all these explorer. Actually, the other one recently was Tacit knowledge. And that's the other one I wanted to sort of comment on from your comment, Jeremy. Is another way to kind of frame it is like, there's a lot of things inside the organization where management is trying to drive the like making tacit knowledge explicit, right? They're trying to sort of like help everybody to understand the thing that lives in your head, because we know so many people learn so much through experience, and there's real value as management in helping others. And I think AI offers this like amazing opportunity to kind of turn the tacit explicit. And I think, that's a piece where we can even comprehend yet what that's going to mean for companies, right? Like I was just listening to Toby Luckey, the Shopify CEO, on a podcast. And he was basically saying like, the exciting thing about running a company right now is like to imagine how terrible the way we're running companies is going to look in 10 years.
That's great. I mean, even a simple GPT is effectively a codification of tacit knowledge, right? And that's one thing that I liked about Ginny in our conversation with her. We were just asking, when do you know you need to build a GPT? And she said, when I want to share knowledge with someone else. That's so simple, but it's such a good way to think about it. It's a way of externalizing your thought process and effectively scaling your own tacit knowledge.
Exactly.
I wonder, so this is a little bit of a tangent, and if it doesn't trigger anything, no worries, but are there ways to identify the tacit knowledge that's worthy of a GPT? You know what I mean? Like, what are there heuristics or kind of rules of thumb for which of my areas of tacit knowledge should I be codifying?
I have this 2x2 for what it's worth, because I think like, although I don't get this question in exactly these terms, I get a sort of version of it, which is like the version that you get asked from enterprises, right? Is like, where do we start? Which in my mind is sort of a version of that question. It's like, how do we qualify what kinds of problems? And so my 2x2 is kind of the y-axis is impact on the organization, and the x-axis is the complexity of the problem, right? Like how many steps does it take to solve it? So in that case, like low impact, low complexity, that's just like give everybody access to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, Gemini, one of these models, and let them figure out their own stuff. That's a lot of the, change the bullets, or even some of the do the job that is not part of my job technically, and just sort of like help me solve that problem. I think the top left, which is the low complexity, high impact, that's the place where to me, GPTs can have the biggest impact. And a good place to look is, where do you have problems that there are a sort of small group of people who are really good at them, and it would be great if everybody could be just that good. And I think in that way, it also kind of reframes a lot of the conversation around AI, because obviously so much of it is about what's going to happen to the workforce. And, we can talk about that if you guys want to talk about it. But I think that reframing what the potential of AI is, distributing best practices, sort of like raising all boats, is really interesting and really true. I think that's exactly what Jenny is saying, right? It's like in those moments where you want to take the tacit knowledge that exists in your brain and make it explicit and available to other people. That's what it does. Now, again, GPTs are best at solving a specific kind of problem, right? They're best at solving those single step problems because you're dealing with the model almost independently. And then when you get into the kind of multi-step high impact is when I think you think about building something greater, whether you call it a bot or an agent, or, it's like when I'm describing the transcript thing that runs through 16 steps to get to the final output. And it wouldn't be anywhere near the level of fidelity without running through all those steps.
Practically speaking there, in that case, do you chain GPTs together? How do you call the various steps of those, or is there someone manually actually?
No, I'm just writing code.
Okay.
So I build it, whether it's like build it in code. I find Airtable to be a great platform for building stuff. I really love it. They've added some nice AI functionality. You can write code in there. And so that's a way to sort of like build those multi-step processes without building all the sort of scaffolding and code around it. But I would say over the last sort of year and a half, I found a stack that works for me. And I've made it really easy for myself to just kind of stand up and deploy apps. And this transcript thing probably was 5 hours of work from start to finish.
The project that you and I worked on together, which was fun, was Jeremy, we were kind of riffing around the fact that there are Wikipedias for dog breeds, but not for mixed dog breeds. And so Noah helped create like a mixed dog breed. And so there's 336 official dog breeds. And so if you suddenly want like a Wikipedia of all of them, it's like 336 and 336, which is what, 160.
I think it's what, factorial? Do you get a factorial in there? You've got to.
And so Noah built this really fun site where we basically had GPT write the description of what these breeds might kind of like, what might be some of the properties, and then render an image of what they might look like. And it was remarkably well in the way that it performed. But Noah, do you have other, like, you're very good at making these kind of small apps all the time. What are some of the fun little quirky apps that you built recently?
Yeah. Well, right after we did that dog one, I did a brand collab one that was sort of in a similar vein. It's a brand, brxnd.ai. But you can take any two brands and you choose the product and it'll make the collab. And what it goes through, it runs through this process where it actually writes I took a bunch of collab announcements and I used those to fine tune a model where it writes the collab announcement first. And then from the collab announcement, it actually generates the image. To me, the theme there that is really fun is like making things that could exist but don't exist. in mass. Like that's really interesting. Actually, I was recently just having fun. I haven't launched this particular experiment, but I built a e-commerce site, like a fake e-commerce site, but it all generates on the fly. It's a little bit inspired by WebSim if you've played with WebSim, but it's all e-com. So you like type in a product and it like builds the search result page. So I was playing with one of those super fast inference APIs. And so it like literally builds it all on the fly. And then if you decide to click on one of the products, it builds the entire product detail page on the fly.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And the whole idea is like the prompt for all the products is like, be real, just like 15% off from reality, right? So like it should seem almost real, but there's sort of something fundamentally removed. That was
That's
great.
so good.
But one thing that you also learned when you did that, which I thought was very inspiring, was you pointed out that if GPT hasn't understood the essence of your brand, then you haven't communicated very well. And so based on that insight, I now use it for a lot of things. I use it for our own brands to see all the stuff we're putting out is basically the way that GPT kind of computed that. Is that what we wanted? But I also think that you can do that with kind of everything else. Like I have a new book coming out and basically put the whole thing in and saying, basically, what is this book about? And then, I mean, like directionally, you want it to be what the takeaway should be.
I mean, that's one of the big pieces of advice actually I have for folks, especially at brands who are just getting started, is like focus on using this as a reaction machine instead of using it as a generation machine. I think part of where people get so overwhelmed is like trying to get it to write things. But it's like, it's amazing at that, right? It's amazing as a reader. And for anything where what you need is like a fairly regular point of view on the thing, that's awesome, right?
Well, one thing I've noticed that you have to do there, just for people who actually take that seriously, and I totally agree, you've got to tell it to be like a Russian Olympic coach, right? Be brutally honest, pull no punches, because otherwise it's like, you get an 85, like B+, there's a couple things, right? But I know this isn't B+ work. It's not, right? And so you actually have to, because it's a helpful assistant, right? You got to force it to be brutally honest with you.
Yeah. I actually had a pretty funny one. I have a Claude project for doing my editing because I find it does a better job at editing. So it's got a bunch of examples of my work and some specific instructions, and also a copy of Strunk and White Elements of Style, because that's my preferred style guide. But the other day I put something in and it basically just insulted me. It came back and said, this is not up to Noah Brier standards.
Wow. Yes. You know, another thing that you just triggered, I don't know why, we talked to Steven Johnson, who's one of my heroes, writer, who's been at Google building Notebook LM. And when you mentioned loading all the Explore, Exploit, or Tacit knowledge papers in, having a conversation, I don't know if you've done this yet, but a super cool thing you can do is load it into Notebook LM, and then it will generate a podcast on the fly. That is actually, I would suggest, is a really cool extrapolation synthesis of all those documents. And for me, what I like is, instead of now sitting looking at my stinking screen, which I'm so tired of, I can effectively take the synthesis on the road and go for a walk and have a thoughtful, comprehensive view, or not comprehensive, but at least a thoughtful overview of the stuff that I load in.
Yeah. I have not played too much with Notebook LM only because I have a policy for myself that you should avoid Google projects that are in labs because they're probably just going to kill it.
Yeah. You don't want to fall in love too quickly. This character is going to die.
But it's like Steven Johnson is also one of my favorites, and I have been very, very inspired by him, both from his writing and also he famously wrote a piece about the way he used Devonthink in like 2008. And,
yes.
Since then I have been thinking about how I have been fairly heavy note user, and I guess it's now come to be called personal knowledge management. But I need to dig in more. I have this bias against Google.
Your bias is founded for sure. I mean, high wave at Google wave, but it's also, I would say, you are going to fall in love. So that's all warning you, and it will rip your heart out of your chest if they take it away. But I was in a session yesterday with 50 executives. On the fly, we're generating a press release about a new kind of AI initiative for this company. Then we load in that and its quarterly earnings into Notebook LM. And while we're talking, we have Notebook LM generate a podcast, and then we played it. Noah, I have never seen people's faces look like that. I've been teaching for 15 years. I've taught in person tens of thousands of people and virtually a lot more. I have literally never seen people's faces like that. You had people, they were holding their faces in their hands because it's just like, there's no way this is happening right now. It's crazy.
So let's go to what CMOs are asking you for right now and what you are
Finally, going back to my canonical question from the beginning. By the way, Noah, we're lucky to get there because most times we never get to the first question that we started with. This is a success.
Yeah. What are CMOs asking? So I think obviously a lot of them are just asking, how do we get started? Where do we get started? What should we be thinking about? I think increasingly what really kind of I found most interesting was I was getting questions like, hey, we need to understand, we want to look at the entire competitive space. We want to understand everything that they're saying. We want to understand who they're talking to, how they're talking to them. And we want to be able to sort of both understand how we stack up against that, but also where the white space is. So like who is talking to which audience and how heavily flooded is that particular audience versus another one. And that was actually one of the moments where I was like, oh, this is what I want to be doing. It's literally got a call where it was like, hey, we've been thinking about this for a long time and we're really interested in figuring out a way to solve it. Maybe there's some way you could do it. And by the way, we need it in 3 weeks for the CEO. And I was like, okay, sure. Yeah, let's try. And, you know, we scraped like 20,000 articles and classified them and scored them and built these matrices. And the sort of magic of it is not just that you build the whole thing, but because it's code, you can quickly flip from being backward looking to forward looking, right? Where you can move it from just being a thing that does analysis of what happened in the past to now putting in new stuff and analyze what might happen. I think that general idea though, like I actually, we're just about to start a new project with a very large company, taking a sort of global brand strategy and helping them to localize it, right? Because it's like a classic sort of marketing problem is we have this strategy, it got developed in the US or whatever largest market is, and now all these other markets need to execute on it, but like they don't have access to that, the tacit knowledge of the individual in the sort of home market who developed it. And we don't want to decide for them what they want to do. They need some level of autonomy in that local market, but how can we help guide them and sort of like expand that? And so we're just starting a project on that. I think that general idea of like, I think my big aha, honestly, over the last 6 months has been, I was looking for like the software solution, the SaaS answer, like what is the SaaS product to be built in this? And I think I came to the conclusion that actually like this is net new software, right? This is sort of software or software never existed before because it couldn't, right? So it's that strategy problem or even that content problem. Like that was I've solved sort of versions of that content problem in the past with a big team in 3 or 4 months and like a lot of budget. And now essentially like my big team is however many tokens I used on across the models. And
But just to see that I understand, I mean, what you're articulating is that this idea of having generic software where we as users have to adapt ourselves to the common denominator because that's how you scale a SaaS software. Now we're building bespoke software, as it were, per company, per department, per individual.
I think, I'm still thinking through this, but I do think like it's a little back to the future. I think that what has happened, and I think part of why the whole software world is a little bit unsure of sort of what AI means is because when you've got these amazing models that are available to you for, like fractions of a penny per call, right? The value of the specific code kind of goes down, right? Like the intelligence is what matters the most. And the kind of specific code you write, which used to be the kind of most valuable foundational element of a software product, I think kind of becomes less valuable. And it becomes more about sort of how are you incorporating the individual expertise inside that organization, whether it's around the strategy or whatever else, and sort of applying that, because like that's where I think there's quite a bit of evidence that this is true, right? If you look at some of the studies on just prompting techniques and sort of few shot versus chain of thought, there's a paper from Microsoft in December about med prompt. And essentially, it was this sort of like very complicated prompting technique that very few people will ever use. But the takeaway from the paper, and there's a great chart, is that a good enough prompt can outperform a fine-tuned model, right? And so to me,
You
what
mean
that
just to a frontier model, a good enough prompt to a
a
frontier.
good enough prompt to a frontier model can
Yeah.
outperform that same frontier model, but fine-tuned, right?
Mm.
And my takeaway from that stuff is like the more sort of, specialized you get in the way you build these systems, the more specialized your prompts get, the more specialized you are in the way you build the workflows around them, which is like just how do you break up the prompts? How do you break up the problem into pieces? The more I sometimes call them private tokens. So it's like, if you sort of imagine that these things were just trained on all of the public information, naturally they come back with median answers to questions, right? And so how do you get them to deliver above median answers? Well, obviously you give it a bunch of private tokens, right? And the private tokens are basically the expertise that lives inside the heads of the individuals inside these companies. And so I don't know. I mean, the challenge, going back to your question, Henrik, is like, I know that building SaaS is fundamentally counter to that, because the whole thing you have to do when you build SaaS, as somebody who built SaaS for over a decade, is you generalize problems, right? You've got to make it so everybody can use it. And I just think like now we live in a very different world. And that's without even accounting for the fact that we're in this explore exploit thing, right? Like we're not in exploit yet, right? We are definitely still in explore. And I think part of it is like all these companies want to come out, like Salesforce just had Dreamforce, and Mark Benioff is on stage saying Agentforce is the answer to every question that you never knew you had. And it's like, I just don't know how that could possibly be true in a world where we don't even know, like we're explorer by definition. When you're in an explore phase, it's like you don't even know the questions yet, right? And so how could they know the answers to the questions we don't know yet? And so I don't know. When I combine those things, I just see that you can build incredible value by taking the implicit knowledge and expertise from individuals and combining it with some expertise about code and software development and AI. And you can just sort of very quickly roll up kind of amazing solutions to problems that can perform at world-class levels. So I did another project with a very large brand where we, in 10 hours, prototyped a copywriting solution. They had already seen multiple versions, and none of them were at the level that they required. And in 10 hours, by working with one of their copywriters, we were able to prototype a version that was able to deliver copy at the required level of the organization.
Wow.
And it's like, but not because I'm great at writing copy, because like I was working with somebody who's great at writing copy.
With the human, with the tacit knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of brought us full circle back to where we started around explore, exploit. And my question for you is, so you think about the founder of the future or the entrepreneur of the future, you're moving from the exploratory, you deliberately went into an explore mode after exploiting and, exiting, et cetera. Now, as you go back into exploit, I know right at the beginning, one thing you said was, what was attractive to you about going into explore mode is you didn't have to have any employees, you didn't have to have any investors. There's all this stuff that you didn't like, right? How does your working mastery of and with generative AI affect how you're going to move into exploit mode this time around?
I'm not sure yet. I mean, I'm just at the beginning of that new journey. So it's probably hard to say where the sort of lines are between my mastery of AI and just my prior experiences and wanting to correct and sometimes overcorrect for different things. But one piece is just like a lot of the work is clearly going to be outsourced to various systems. I just got this system done this morning for doing the transcript. So it runs it through the whole process. It kicks it out to Slack. It even has a vector database sitting behind it, so it can show you related conversations that happened. It sucks out all the questions that got asked in the conversation, and then it uses a separate vector database for finding similar questions and then creating canonical answers as new answers come on board. And some of it is just like, we're going to experiment with a lot of that stuff and see sort of how much we can do.
That sounds so cool.
It's all, I think it's cool. I don't know. I literally just shipped
No,
it
that's
this
great.
morning.
But what about like, are you looking for something different with employees? Are you looking for a different kind of cap table? Like, are there more pragmatic?
No investors, which I don't know that that has anything to do with generative AI, but it's just I'm happily investor free. But our first hire is very senior engineer. I think it's very different than what I would have approached naturally. I think my biggest open question, which kind of relates to the question you had, Henrik, about sort of like the skill set, is like, so I decided that the first person I wanted to hire was one of the best engineers I ever worked with, who is not deep in AI. And my thought is he's a much better engineer than I am. And so he can help me on the engineering side and speed up all the ways that I work. And I know a lot more about AI than he does. And so I can help him on the AI side. We sort of meet at this software development point, which turns out to be kind of hugely important. Like what I keep finding actually is that a big part of being successful in building something with a company is just figuring out the data model, right? This is kind of classic software development 101. It's kind of like a strategic process. What's the problem? I was working on a proposal generator recently with somebody, and they sent me a whole bunch of their proposals, and we were going through it, and they were like, oh, we have this part of the proposal and this part of the proposal. And I was like, well, I don't really get how these two are different. Like, and they're like, oh, well, sometimes, and it's like, it turned out that they're not really different, right? They just call it different things sometimes. And when you're actually trying to figure out how you're going to put that in a database, like sort of data modeling 101 is like, okay, well, that's in the same table, and you're going to sort of combine those two ideas. And so, that's something that I think is a place where we kind of meet, but it's still a fairly open question to me of who are going to be the best kind of people to work on this. And I guess partially from my prior experience, I'm betting on working with someone who's extremely talented, who I like working with. Seems like a solid place to start. And then, a good way to kind of experiment and learn on the kinds of skills that it's going to take to succeed. I certainly think that just we're going to need a lot less people. I can already tell you that, like, the things that I've been able to do in the last 2 years, I mean, I keep telling people I feel like I have a superpower, right? I think this is what a lot of people are writing code and have gotten into AI. I feel like it's kind of the most amazing thing, right? I feel like I just outsource I'm like, okay, well, I know how to do this, but there's no
I don't
reason.
even think you have to write that as good. I mean, I, as you know, don't write any code or really, but I understand enough now to ask Claude to write me code. And then I know how to copy paste it either into Cursor or into Replit. And then I understand enough to press the play button and then basically say, I just got this error message.
That's the green one, right? That's the green.
Yeah. And then sometimes Claude will answer like, you just have to fix like line 58. And I go like, no. You just have to print out the whole, like main.py again.
Yeah. What's up with that? Like fixing, like I'm going to go in and correct one line here. Come on.
Like, just copy paste the whole thing in, assuming that. So,
I will say, actually, it's funny you say that. Like recently, I feel like the models have gotten that message, and somewhere in the system prompt, they are now sort of giving you the full context all the time. And I've actually been struggling with some GPTs and Claude projects where I'm like, no, I actually just don't want you to keep repeating the entire thing every time. Can you just give me like the changes? Because I get it. You've got the whole thing, but like, I want to know that you changed 3 things in 700 words and just tell me the 3. And I've been like sometimes struggling a little bit to.
But sometimes it doesn't is the thing.
No,
I mean, that's the thing that's frustrating.
Yeah. That's the worst thing when you're in voice mode, because it still kind of seems to be prompted in text mode. Noah, thank you so much for doing this.
Drop that mic. That was very awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, really, really appreciate it as always, Noah, and excited to hear about the new thing. I guess that's require a separate call so I can get the deeds.
Yeah, we should let's have a jam session soon. I got to show you all the weird shit I've been building too.
I'm into that.
Talk to you soon. Thanks, guys.
Wow. Okay, so that was really exceptional. There's a lot there.
He's such an interesting guy. You've always been such a thing. He used to be kind of like a brand strategist, and it's always so fascinating what he was kind of like. His writing is really interesting. He writes like an amazing blog post also. Why don't we just start from the start? What's just some of your big takeaway, Mr. Utley?
There's a bunch of stuff here. I'm just going to rattle through, and then you just dive in wherever you're interested. One question that I thought was super cool was, when's the last time you had a cancel all meetings moment? He talked about that, getting access to a new feature. And he said, I've just got to get my hands dirty. I think that exhibits a level of enthusiasm and investment. I think it's a good question for everybody to ask. Another point that I thought was really cool was the idea when we were asking about Jenny and Russ and he having time to experiment. And he just said, don't wait till you have the job. Just explore and become the kind of person who deserves the job. I thought that was really cool. Like not waiting till you have permission, so to speak. I think especially for young folks, there may be a sense that, oh, it's kind of outside of my scope. No, not if you bring it inside your scope. I thought that was really cool. And then, of course, I love his comment about Gen AI is not just a generation machine. It's actually a really exceptional reaction machine. And I think that's a cool way to flip the paradigm for some folks when they're dipping their toes into Gen AI. One thing I've had folks do, for example, is say, think of an idea that you really like. Ask ChatGPT to critique your idea. Ask ChatGPT to poke holes in your thinking. And all of a sudden you go, oh, it's actually really good at understanding, right? So I think that's a cool kind of way to turn the tables on AI that really helps people see a different side of the capabilities. What about you? What stood out?
I mean, I really like just this kind of very obvious idea of you can do so much with it now. Like we on this podcast, like newsletters is always like, what's going to happen in 5 years and with the new model and artificial intelligence and all this stuff. But I think the reality is, as Ethan Wallach also said, like you could just start, get going on now. And I think it's somewhat fascinating that it is a little bit complicated to get going beyond like the first, or beyond the prompt, beyond the kind of the first kind of like initial attempt you have, because it is about trying to understand how do you take your chain of thought and how do you kind of atomize that and then start to kind of like figuring out where can I plug AI in that. And so I thought that was interesting. The whole thing about SaaS going away, which obviously is fascinating.
Hot take.
In the venture industry, that this has been the hottest kind of like investment opportunity for us many years because it was such an incredible thing, right? You had people often pay a subscription revenue for something that literally didn't cost anything to replicate. You made one version of the software and then you sold to many people. And so the whole idea, and I think Chamath have talked about this too, that any SaaS software increasingly now will be bespoke software built on top of AI in terms of organizations, but also like for individuals. And so maybe that prompted the question, if somebody were to write the perfect software for you, what would that software be? And maybe there's something there. I would say finally, this is not something we spoke too much about, but he brought it up. And he wrote this piece, I think a year ago, where he talked about building the first basically plugin to ChatGPT. And he wrote about this thing that's called a manifest, which I'll give you a little bit of explanation why I think it's such a big thing. When you have a website, you have something called often a robot.txt file on your website. And what it does is that it tells Google's kind of crawler when it comes by your website, what it should expect, what it wants you to think of, and all this different stuff. So it's a little bit of like, hey, Google, here's the cheat sheet for my whole website. And so what the manifest file is a file that you can put on your website to basically do the same thing for when AI start to interface with your website. Here is how you should expect data to come from me. And then what ChatGPT does is basically say, okay, I got it now. Now just give me data, in whatever form you want. And that started me kind of this whole rabbit hole of what is the future going to look like when we have agents, like when we get the new iPhone and we start to talk to a Siri that actually understands and are able to do something. What does Siri then talk to? Do they just talk to websites? And obviously, as somebody who builds companies, what am I then expected to have built in the other end? And so what I and some of my colleagues, and specific Nicholas, as you know, have kind of thought a lot about recently is like, that might mean that we have to almost build the receiving agent on the other side. Or we have to think about our companies less so as just an app or a website. It's increasingly a piece of intelligence that can talk to the intelligence that we had used to just ask. And so this whole agent to agent conversation for me kind of really got started when Noah wrote that blog post about manifest files. And so,
Let's link that in the show notes so that folks can dig into it if
yeah,
they
that's a
want
good
to.
idea. That's a great. So
Two
long-winded,
other
long-winded takeaway, but that was the takeaway.
No. The other thing, there's two other things that I thought are just kind of cool shorthand tips for folks if you're looking for opportunities to get started. One is, what's the hated but helpful workflow? I thought that's a great kind of diagnostic tool. The thing that is so useful that you want people to do it, even though they hate it. Wow, that's right in the crosshairs of building. And then the other one was around the GPTs for tacit knowledge. And I liked his 2x2 of impact and complexity. And he said that the upper left is where there's the biggest opportunity for GPTs. Problems where it'd be great if a lot of people knew how to do what only a few people currently know how to do. And codifying that knowledge where it's high impact but low complexity. I thought that's pretty helpful 2x2 if you're thinking about where do I get started building GPTs. So hated but helpful, the 2x2 of high impact, low complexity. You heard it here first, folks.
And I think with that was another episode of Beyond the Prompt. We should get one of Suno to make like a jingle for us or some kind of cool music.
Totally. We are going beyond the prompt.
We should make the AI do that.
Actually, you know what that reminds me of is there's an old episode of The Office where Jim gets in the car with Andy and they're sitting there silently for a minute and Jim goes, "Do you have any music?" And Andy goes, "Thought you'd never ask." Give me the beat, boys. And Jim's like, "I meant like a CD or a CD."
That's awesome, dude. Well,
So with that, that's a wrap.
It's a wrap. Thank you again for people listening. And as always, we love when other people get introduced to this podcast and we love to get feedback. So either share it, like it, subscribe, all that stuff. Or if you have any ideas of who we should talk to or things that you'd like us to, like a subject matter for us to address, then just send us, connect on LinkedIn and let us know.
We're eager to hear. Peace.